determined that maybe it'd be a good idea to get a bunch of pictures together so you kids could remember your ancestors. Going back, I found them back as far as my great-grandfather, Lars Alm. And I'm hoping that your mother will do the same thing about the Breffel and the Wheelock families, so that you have a complete picture of where you came from. And it's been about, I say 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 years since I got this idea in my head, and I made the mistake of purchasing an old black album I was going to write underneath every picture, and Eric persuaded me that it'd be better if I just numbered the pictures and talked into this machine. The bad thing, that black paper didn't hold very well either, so I made a mistake both ways, but I put it on there with some good glue, so there's no changing it. So now today, which is in February of 2003, I've got the pictures pretty well together, and I'm going to start recording and telling you what each picture, the people on each picture, and the ins and outs and ups and downs, the good and the bad of the family. For me, it's the Grund family and the Hugberg family. I don't have so much background on the Hugberg family. I just go back to my grandfather there, and I don't know nearly as much about him as I do about the Grunds. But I'll try and remember each one of the aunts and uncles there on both sides. Now I'm going to try again to start to tell you about Lars Alm. Lars Alm got that name. It is actually, I believe, a Roman name. He was a part of what we would call, I think, a quasi-military, in that he was like a constable that lived in a small village, and he got some of his income from the population and some from the state. They called him a knecht. Grace also discovered this when she went to Sweden and looked up his history. His name, of course, was Lars, and so his children would take his given name and add son to it for their surname. So his children were Larsons. So Grandpa was born and christened Peter Larson. He came to this country, I thought, in 1884, but Grace likewise says 1882 on her part of the history, and she could very possibly be correct because she lived down there closer. Anyway, when he came, his brother came with him, and also a sister later came. Her name was Mrs. Amandus Anderson, and she lived out on the coast of Washington. And she must have been quite a bit younger because she died about 1950, I believe. Annabelle seen her a couple of times and went up there after she died. When they changed their names, I don't know, whether it was when they came through at Ellis Island or if they changed it shortly afterwards. Grandpa's brother took the name of Nygren, they would say in English, or the Swedes would say Nygren, which would mean the new branch. Grandpa took our name, we don't know why, and it's a shame nobody asked. A few years ago, Ted's wife Leah went in and signed her name, and the person that she was dealing with said, "Is that your name?" And she said, "Yes, it's my husband's." And so then she said, "That's my name too," and they started talking, and both families had come from Minnesota, and there was a Louis in both families, so they were convinced we were related. They had me call the old grandfather, and I did, and he said that they had taken the name, that name had come with them from Sweden, and that his family were what he called iron workers. They had made armor, he said, for the King of Sweden, and Grandpa was a blacksmith, which I think is what the man was saying they were, and maybe he knew of that family and felt close to them, so he took their name. Anyway, that's what it came. They landed in Foley, Minnesota originally, and stayed there about 7 years. My father and Uncle Andrew were born in Sweden, and Ma Peterson and Minnie were born in Foley. The rest were born after they moved up to Argyle. where they homesteaded on a quarter of land. I don't think Grandpa was a great success as a farmer. That was a nice country, good country there out of Argyle, very good country. I was back there in 1980. Everton took me over to the old place. Vivian was along and Mary, and the house was gone. And the man that was on the place told us where they had moved it to, up along the highway there. And when we left, Everton drove down that road, and I spotted a house off to the side on an access road that I thought resembled the old house, because I had seen a picture of it, and it was distinctive in that it had 4 gables. We drove in there, and sure enough, that was the house. I believe it's north of New Polden, Minnesota. Anyway, there is a picture of that a little later on that I'll probably mention, and Grandma is on that picture, and that's the only picture I have of her, and it's very indistinct. I don't know exactly when Grandpa came down to Pitt. Grace says he moved there in 1921, but I think that he homesteaded, or he bought that land before that time, because the house that Peterson's built was built in 1918, and I think that they got that 80 from Grandpa. If I remember the story right, and here again I wish I had written these things down, that Grandpa said, if you move out there so I have a place to stay, I will give you that 80, and he kept the 180 himself. He was a big, raw-boned sort of a man. He had, in my time, I can remember that he had buckskin pants, and we kept them for a long time. I suppose that eventually was thrown away. He had also an enormous sheepskin coat that went clear down to his ankles. He had these distinctive, hard protrusions on his wrists that some of us inherited, and I'm one of them. He thought a lot of me because I was the grandchild he lived with, and he used to every day take me for a little walk up the road. I don't know if it was every day, but it seemed to me like it was. We went up to a place called John's Ditch, which had nothing to do with me, but the man next door was a Swede called John Erickson, and he had dug a ditch by hand from the swamp out to the road, and it was just a little ways up there, and we'd go up and come back every day. One time, Pa Peterson told me that they'd had a kind of an ornery bull, and the bull had got loose, and when he found the bull, he had approached Grandpa and I when we were coming back for a walk, and there was the old man trying to fend the bull off with his cane, and I was behind him. Anyway, Pa got hold of the bull and took care of him. The earliest thing I can remember, the earliest remembrance that I have of my life, was one time following Grandpa over to Norquist. Now, he must have got started ahead of me, because I can't remember him being with me, but I got just inside of Norquist's fence, and like a little boy, I walked across the mud hole, and I had little rubber boots on, and I got stuck out in there, and I couldn't get out. And I remember just standing there and hollering, and I can't remember whether it was Grandpa or who came back and got me out, but that's the first thing I can remember. He cleared up his 80 there, or it was almost all cleared up, and he was clearing on a place where if you were to go to the old Peterson place, or what is McLeod's now, and go south across the bridge, it would be immediately on the right. He started in there and he didn't finish. And that's where this picture number 2 was taken, in a brush pile there. He kept on clearing till he was so old he almost couldn't clear anymore. And I remember one time we come home from town, and Grandpa had been out there clearing, and he came home, and he got about 2/3 the way up the hill out there by the house. There was a little bush there along the path where we went down to the river to get water, and he was there, and he couldn't get up the hill. And Annabelle went, and I believe it was Annabelle, went and helped him up. But he gave me his watch. He had one of them big old Waltham watches that you had to open up the case and pull a little trigger out that would set it, and then you pushed it back into place and put the thing back on. And Ma wouldn't let me have that watch until I was, I think, 21 years old. It had a leather strap on it, and he used to take and hold that watch in his hand, pull the leather strap over the back, and hold it up to my ear so I could hear it tick. Anyway, once in my young life, I put that watch in a upper part of my bib overalls and went to town, and that's the last I ever seen of it. It must have fallen out. It's just a crime that that thing was not saved. It would be a great heirloom today. Anyway, he lived until 1932 in the spring. And by this time, Ed had left, and Grandpa wanted so bad to see Ed, and it wasn't possible. Ed couldn't come. Ed came home that year later on, but I don't want to get ahead of my story here now. I think this is about all I need to tell you about Grandpa. I have another picture or two that we'll be mentioning him, where he's sitting with several generations, Ma and Elmer and Arlita. So there will be 4 generations there. Before I leave Grandpa, I maybe should tell you a little bit about Grandma. She was a little, short, stout woman, and she was a Soderstrom, and her sister was married to a man by the name of Nordquist. And these people were fairly close to us. There was quite a large family. There was a boy, Aaron, that I never knew, though I did see his daughter, I believe. And then there was Charlie that lived right next door to Peterson's. And then there was Manny, who came there periodically, and he was a very grand man. And he was Helmer's father, who later married Rona. And then there was Gottfried that was in New York, or in Chicago. And we saw him once in a while. He was a kind of a tough little guy. But the Norquists were quite close to us, and of course, you boys would know Hildur and Millie, which were the result of that. There was another daughter there, too, by the name of, what was her name, Vivian?
Louise.
Louise. She was much older than Millie and Hildur. I don't quite know the reason, but she died. She had a miscarriage and died. I never knew her at all. Charlie likewise died, I think about the time Grandpa did, but they were close neighbors, and we neighbored a lot, especially in the early days when there were a few settlers before, when I was very, very young. But they were close members of the family. Now in this story there will be also mentioned about some Norquists. Now these are completely different. There's one letter missing. The family that lived next to us was Nordquist. I think the name, likewise in both instances, means the North Branch. However, they just dropped the D out of it. But there were 2 other Norquist families that didn't have the D in their name that were close to us. And I'll get into them later on when I'm telling you about P.L. Grund's descendants. Picture number 3 is of Louis, my father, at a pretty young age. I think this was taken a while before he was married. He got started in various things that were contracting and so the like. He had 2 large steam engines and thrashing machines that he thrashed with and plowed with, and I've seen some old bills of some plows he bought. I think they were like 6 or 8 bottoms, which was big in those days. I'll get on to that later. But anyway, he got started in that business before he was married. I've seen a letter that Verona has where he was writing to my mother shortly before their marriage when she was teaching school, and he was talking about some contract he had signed for $300-400 that I think was big in that time. Now this would have been the early 1900s. They were married in 1908. Married Amelia Hugberg, and they were married. I can't just recall. Just a minute. I think I have it here. November 28, 1908, and Millard was born the following year in November, just about a year later. They moved to Pitt in January, it says, of 1911. It was just recently burned over very desolate looking, and they bought a sawmill there that a man had started. And it had been a sawmill, and there continued to be a sawmill there until up into the 70s. Louis loved to saw logs and to log. That was one thing to do, and I don't think there ever was too much farmer in it. Prior to this time, he had spent a winter working in the woods in Escanaba, Michigan, and he had worked there with Theodore Peterson. Now, just exactly what year this was, I don't know, but Ma and Pa Peterson were married in 1902, and so it was prior to this. He sawed there and I think done well in the early 20s. But things were starting to taper off by the mid-20s at the time I was born, and then my mother died. And then besides this, the markets went haywire. I know that he went to Michigan, or to Chicago, I believe, and got a job doing something in shortly after my mother died. And while he was there, he got an eye injury that was, he was losing his sight. He came home and he went up to Winnipeg, I believe. Alton told me this, and a doctor there was able to help him, and so he got his sight back. In the late 20s, the markets, of course, went haywire, and for instance, we had he had sold a bunch of birch squares to a furniture company in Chicago. They canceled the order. We eventually burned them up. The culmination of the whole thing was about 1930. The bank foreclosed, and he lost everything. We didn't even have horses. And of course, those times were hard. I don't see any picture in here of the Virginia Bridge, but I have some, and I don't know how come they're not in these ones. I'm redoing this now because a piece got erased. I'm doing this in 2004. In 1932, he bid two bridges, one just north of Virginia, and there was some bad material underneath. The state told him to go down deeper, and they would pay the extra. And he did this and poured the one bent. They moved one abutment. They moved across the river, and it was deeper there. And he tried to use the same sheet piling, and they weren't quite long enough. And when they got all ready to pour, I think they had started to pour, the river come in. Had to do it all over again. Hence, they got into overtime, and he lost money on the job. And when he lost money on the job, the bonding company had to pay it off. And when they did, then he lost his bond for the next job. What happened was that Minneapolis Bridge took over this, and Louis run the job, and it was a good job, and they made money on it, but it was too late then. Continued in this that winter or two, and then he built a couple of bridges on Highway 72 north and west of Baudette, and then I think that was the last of the bridge building. I don't know exactly where to start here now, but I'll start with picture number 5, was taken in the woods camp someplace up around Pitt, I believe. The one lady on the left there is Aunt Christine, and the little boy is either Roger or Vernon, I don't know which. Picture number 6 is one of the big steam engines, the big thrashing machines. They had a crew of about 30 people, and they fed with 4 men. Right at the front wheel of the steamer is Louis. Sitting on the wheel is one of the Grund boys. I don't know which. It could be either Axel or it could be Andrew. On top of the thrashing machine is Billy Engen on the left, and then P.L. Grund on the right. Picture number 7 is one of the machines from the back end again. I believe that I'm filling in right now, and I'm surely sorry I lost that other words, because I think I was doing a better job of telling the story. I've got a picture now that I didn't have at the time when I made it. This recorder is playing tricks on me too. Anyway, this picture is of Ellen Grund and her husband Alfred, and they had 2 daughters when she died in 1918 in the flu. They were raised by Alfred's sisters. One of them was Mrs. Pete Gunderson. I can't recall who the other one was. Now, I'm going to try and fill in a little because I've got a big blank space here yet. I don't know what I have missed and left out, and that's tragic. I just, somewhere or another, got a big chunk erased. But the times of the 30s were very difficult. I mentioned that we didn't even have horses. The boys worked for the neighbors and got the use of horses to come back and cut hay and so forth. He salvaged some way at the sale. I imagine he saved a few dollars out, and he had several cows. I think we had like 4 or 5 cows and maybe 30 sheep. And these sustained us in those hard times. We had the telephone office too that Mildred kept there. And of course, after the going broke in the bridge, things were really difficult, and they stayed that way until somehow or another, about 1937, he got some money together and he bought us a reasonable sized Alice Chalmers cat. And then he started doing some custom sawing and a little dirt work, moving and so forth, and things started to pick up. And then I think about 39, he started getting into the woods business again, and he logged out of Washkish and Kellier in that area out in what they called the Lost River country. It was out in the swamp, and there was a lot of white pine out in there, and cedar, and also pulpwood, spruce balsam and that kind of nature, and hauled these logs home. And about 1940, I believe it was, he bought a nicer sawmill that came from a guy in Roosevelt and set that up. And in the early 40s there, they sawed, I guess it probably hit its peak about 1944, or in that nature. And then about 48, he logged an enormous amount of Norway pine that he'd all brought home there. And then the lumber market started going bad, and he wouldn't take a reduced price, and the lumber just was pieced out a little bit, and things went from bad to worse. So at the time when he died in 52, he was quite hard up again. We had quite a lot of lumber sitting there, and we pieced it out and sold it, and had an auction sale and disposed of the property. Dorn and Everton continued in the camps and cleaned up most of the timber. We did have to forfeit a little bit, but we salvaged all we could. I don't know what more I can say about Louis, and I'm getting to the end of my rope here, as I'm going to have a blank page yet, but Pa Peterson said of Louis that Louis was great to figure on a project, but he never figured for any trouble. And I think some of his sons inherited the same problem. I know I have been guilty of this. But he was a pleasant father to me. I didn't very, very close to him until really the later years. About 1943, I bought a truck, and at this time we took some cattle to the city. He showed me the cities, showed me where to get a good fancy meal, how to get to the stockyard and things like this, and he rode with me down there a couple, 3 different trips, and we had some good times together. I could fill in a little bit more about Louis. Say he served on the town board a lot, he served on the school board a lot, he was county commissioner for 1 term. He ran for state representative in 1950, I believe it was, and he came within an eyelash of making it. I think he lost by less than 50 votes. He ran against a man that later became senator and eventually run for governor, though he never did make that policy. One of the things I remember about being hard up was there was a Wisconsin or a Minnesota rural resettlement loan against the place. And there was a man by the name of Russ that came occasionally to check and see how things were going. And I remember our fears about every time that man came, there was tension in the house. This recorder is really playing a lot of tricks on me, and I'm having a terrible time. But I found out after Louis died that he had actually lost the place, and it had been bought back in Everett and Alton's name. And that's the way it run until the time he died. I wasn't even conscious of it until then. Anyway, after his decease, when settling the estate, Everett and Alton signed their legal rights to the place away, and it was all put into the estate. All the bills were paid, and the estate was cleared. Likewise, it stayed in the family. Paul bought it, and he never lived there because he was at the time in Michigan. But eventually Douglas bought the place, and so now it's still in the Grund families, which was a good thing. I'm going to try and say just a few more things here before I run out of tape. It'll be about another 20 feet. Hard up as we were in the 30s, I never ever remember anybody being there at mealtime that were not fed. Sometimes I wonder where it all comes from now that I look back. But there was a house that was always open to that kind of a thing. Great deal of pleasure Louis received from being able to give somebody a good piece of meat or fish or something of that nature, or being hospitable. And he was a good cook in his own right, and for several years there he made potato sausage at the holiday time and sold at the Hart store in Baudette. And this was another pleasure he got. I maybe should mention before I quit too that Louis remarried in 1945, 20 years after my mother's death, and married a woman by the name of Cleona. She had been a Dunn, and I think he had known her for quite a while. I'm not sure that I'm going to get all through this right, but anyway, I hope it'll be understandable. Picture number 8 is a reproduction, and it's not too good. In the pictures, it got quite white. But it was a good picture of those three people. My dad stands in the middle, and to his right is my Aunt Christine, and to his left is Ma Peterson. It's good pictures of all three of them. It's just that there's a kind of a fuzzy picture. Number 9 is taken at a picnic. Once in a while, the people from Pitt, the relatives from Pitt, and the ones from Argyll and Warren would get together and have a picnic, and this was one of those cases. And there you can see Ma and Christine standing facing one another. Very typical pose of both of them. And my dad is just behind, reaching to pick up something. He's got a cup of coffee in his hand. My brother Alton's just between my dad and Christine, with a hat on. Picture 10 is, I'm just going to run through these as pictures now, and I'll explain a little more later, but it's Aunt Ellen, who was short like my grandmother, and then Edwin, who was the youngest of the family. Picture number 11 is Andrew. There is another picture of two, but I'll go over Andrew's history a little bit. Andrew was kind of the black sheep of the bunch. He never was a very happy man, I don't think. He was left at the church, I believe, by one of the Norquist girls who was going to marry her. Anyway, it was that close, but it was awfully close. Pa said he was a wonderful steam engineer, but he had a kind of an ornery nature, and he never married. He wound up in Hoquiam. That's where his aunt was, Mrs. Amanda Anderson, and he lived there the rest of his life, as far as I know. He was just kind of a person that Axel stayed with him once, and Axel was working and making a few dollars, and Andrew was just staying home, and Axel come home one time, and Andrew had swept his half of the shack. He just swept half of it. Anyway, he eventually committed suicide. I saw him, that I can remember, only once. He did come back to Baudette in the late 40s, I believe it was, and visited there with Axel for a while. Picture number 12 is taken not long after Dad moved to Pitt. I would just guess probably about 1912 or something thereabouts. You can notice that all the logs are black. It's relatively small, and I think most of it is spruce and balsam. I don't know if that little building there is the one that became the town hall, but the town hall set about there. And it's a crime, that's another thing that's a crime that wasn't kept. It just kind of gradually deteriorated, and Douglas and Gary, or some of those, when they had the mill there in the 50s and 60s, eventually tore it down. The last it was used as an official building was for the election of 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt was elected. The mill that you see there, you can see the steam engine down there. That was a case that he brought. For a while he would bring that case up and saw with it, and then load it on the rail and ship it back down there and thrash with it down in the prairie. Don't know how long he kept on this thrashing. I know that the two steam engines, or the two separators, set in Grandpa's Grove there and just rusted down. I don't know what happened to that big engine. And I've got a picture of that here later that I'll mention to you. But anyway, you can see the engine standing there, and then you can see the husk a little bit more to the right, and the skidway behind it. Picture number 13 is the one I was mentioning before, when they had Holmgren's saw. Look at the size of those logs out behind there. It's quite they're really some pretty good ones. You can see the little Alton is riding carriage. Everton is turning cant. You can see him with the cant hook up. Louis is right behind one of the head blocks. I'm quite sure that's Bernie with the white shirt between the camera and the cat. And I'm not sure whether that's the K or I was talking about picture 13. And to continue there, that little kind of a house you see behind Alton is the engine that runs the trim saw. That little old one-lunger in there, and the trim saw swung on an axis and cut the boards off. Just this side of Alton, you'll see the sawdust carrier. Number 14 is a picture taken in the late 40s. Louis is there on the handle. Paul Peterson is standing directly behind him. Dorn is turning cant, and Ma and somebody else, Ma Peterson and somebody else is back there farther, I don't know. They're sawing some small, long tamarack logs. They used them for timber. Now this tamarack had come out of the swamp, and I don't know how old it was, but it's probably pretty old. Picture 15 was taken after Dad died, and there's some people on there that I can't identify. Vivian thinks that way on the left is a little girl, and it would be Gail. I can't remember Gail being there, but it's very possible because she followed around Alton a lot. And then it's Alton, and then it's Dennis with somebody on his shoulders. I don't know who that would be. Gary is standing down low. He is riding carriage, and Everton is standing up on the beam. What this is we had some house moving timbers that we had no use for anymore, and we were sawing them into lumber so we could market them. Number 16 is taken on the skidway there. George Coranda is up on top. Probably wouldn't mean anything to any of you, and a fellow by the name of Albert Love is there with him. This is logs that come out of the Lost River country in the 40s. Lost River is out in the swamp south and east of Waskish, Minnesota. On the back side of that same thing, picture number 17 is a picture I like of Louis and one of the younger boys. I think again it would be Roger or Vernon. Number 18 shows them pouring the basement for the house where Douglas now lives. The old house stands immediately behind. The window you see there was in my mother, and of course later Millard and Verona's bedroom. The window on the left is in the living room. Directly behind the bedroom where I said was my mother's bedroom, and where the telephone switchboard was, directly behind that was my father's bedroom in the later days, and directly behind the living room, of course, was the kitchen and the pantry. That house was not very big, and of course it wouldn't accommodate all those kids, and I think you all know, I've explained to my own boys anyway, that we had a bunkhouse left over from the logging days where the boys slept. Number 19 is my mother and Everett and Mildred. Mildred is standing in the chair and she's holding Everett in her lap. I think that is on a postcard that my mother sent to Anna when Anna was out in Idaho. See, Mildred was the same age as Paul, and they were born in 1909, and Everton was born in 1911. So you see, this was taken about 1912, or not soon. But there was a card where she mentioned this is myself and my children on Christmas Day, I believe. Number 20 is a picture of the moving camp supplies, and Louis again is on the left. A nice picture of him, and I don't know who the little fella is back. And the man there that looks kind of like Everton is not. I can't remember his name, but Miller knew who he was. The big guy there standing with his hand on the stove is Andrew Brunson. He was the man that I told you about that got a hold of some bad moonshine, evidently shortly after this, and went blind, and he lived at our place the rest of his life. And then I believe the guy on the right is Ole Olson, lived south of Pitt there. Picture 21 is Louis with his big Avery engine. That's a very distinctive picture, and you cannot see his face at all, but there's absolutely no doubt that it's Louis. We don't know who the person is that he is talking to, nor the one on the engine. We're suspicious that the person he's talking to is Theodore Peterson. Annabelle thinks it's Pa. And that the guy on the engine is Billy Engen. I forgot when I was talking to you about on picture number 6 about the people that I recognized on there. I forgot to tell you about the 2 people that's on the machine. The tall guy on this machine is likewise Billy Engen, married to Lina Grund. And the man next to him there is back a little farther is old PL himself. So there's 4 people we know on that picture for sure. Well, we're to picture number 22 now. This is an early picture taken in Pitt. You can see that there is almost no sign of any buildings there yet. You can see the depot and to the right, background, and you can see a few buildings to the left behind. That they would look to me like they would be on what later became Main Street. This is black stuff again, and I think it says on there that there's 600,000 posts, 40,000 ties, 30,000 poles, and 1,000 cords of pulpwood. It's likewise taken by the same photographer that took the picture of the sawmill, the old sawmill, and likewise the picture of the thrashing machine. Picture number 23 shows them loading out in Lost River. Most of this is white pine there. You can see the one on the log right between you and the truck is a white pine log, definitely. They're loading there with a jammer. It's a pretty basic loading tool. Note how big a loads on 23 and 24 are put on that little truck on 8 1/4 tires. Number 25 shows either a cookhouse or a bunkhouse. I don't quite know which, and I'm not able to identify any of those people on that picture. I think the one on the left is Paul Grund, but outside of that I don't know. The next one, it could be Albert Love. Picture number 27 is of the bridge that we went bankrupt on down by Virginia. It's on Sand Lake. Number 26 shows the Highway Department sign. Now, when I went across this bridge last, I don't know when it was still on the highway. And they were at that time making this into a 4-lane road, 2 each way, and I thought that this bridge would still be on the southbound lanes, but I haven't been back there to make sure. Number 28 shows the opposite side. I wish I had taken a picture of the center bent, because there was some extremely nice concrete work there, done in the days when it was done with boards, but it was really nice. Number 29 is Louis in his later years with Cleona, his second wife. He married her when I was 20 in 1945. Number 30 is a picture taken at a picnic, and there's quite a few of the husbands and wives. Starting from the left side is Axel and his wife Irene. And next is Hilda Nordquist, stuck in there. She quite often went on those gatherings together. Next is Mert Cook and his wife Minnie. Now Minnie was the next oldest after Andrew. And then of course it's Cleona and my dad, and then it's Lina and Billy Angan, way to the right. Picture 31 is Ma and Pa Peterson. That's just a picture I took. That's a good picture of them. And that was taken not long before Pa died. 32 is Christine and her 3 children. She married a man by the name of Christensen, and he had some children before. But these are his 3 children. It is, the tall one was Elmer. The middle-sized boy was Buster. He was my age. And then Dolores, the daughter. Number 33 is a picture of the Cook tribe, but I am hardly able to identify anybody on that picture. I can see Mert is the second from the left on the back, and Minnie stands right before him. But then I'm not sure of any. I can't pick out Kenny, which I don't understand. But in picture 35, we've got them all, though the one girl a couple of them I don't know their name. From the left is a girl that was partly crippled, and I can't remember her name at all. And behind them is Lynn, or we called him Len. Poor picture of him. He was a very good-looking man. And then you have Mert. He's a big man. And then Minnie. And then behind Minnie, I don't know what that girl is. There's 2 girls there. There's Ruby and Mrs. Turnland. I don't know which is name. Then way on the far right in the back is Kenny. I really like Kenny, and he spent a fair amount of time at Pitt. Right in front of Kenny is Weston. The girl in front of Minnie is Verna, I believe, and the little boy in front of Mert is Jack. He's about my age, and he was on visitors not too long ago. Verna died tragically when she was about 17. She was I think, ready to graduate from high school, and she got pneumonia or something in the days when it was not easy to handle. Picture 34 is Ed and his wife, and then Edmund and Douglas. Now, I have a lot of pictures of Ed, and I'll go into that later. This whole page here is just kind of husbands and wives. Number 36 is Paul. Speaking again from Pa Peterson's input, that Paul was an awfully nice young man. He did come down to Pitt some, but not so much. He did own a little 40 land or so way out south of Grayson at one time. The tragedy of his life was that evidently he got a girl by the name of Vina Norquist pregnant. And in the fall of 1918, after the harvest in the Red River Valley, he went up north into Canada to try and make a little extra money so they could be married. He contacted the flu. That was the terrible flu epidemic in 1918, and he died. His body was never even sent back, which was a hard one for a lot of the family to bear. But in picture number 37, there is the girl on the right of me there. I'm awful dirty and unkempt, but the girl on the right there is his daughter, Pauline. Very pretty woman, and she lives up in Washington now. She has come down and seen us once. 39 is likewise her as a little girl, and 38, as she's pictured, with Paul and Evelyn Peterson. She was raised mostly by her grandfather, Norquist. Number 40 is a picture on the left is Lina, which became Mrs. Engen, then is my mother, and then is Christine. The one way on the right I do not know. Picture 41 again is a picture of some Norquist and Andrew. Now Andrew is in the middle and the back, and I believe it's a Norquist sitting in the chair, and to Andrew's left is, I think, the woman he was to marry, and it went sour. Number 42 is a picture that was taken, I think, in the mid or end of 40s, but I'm not sure. But it was taken at the Peterson place in Pitt. The lady that has her arm around Ma is Ma's cousin, and she's a Nygren. It's the only picture I have of any of the Nygrens. Number 43 is the original house the Grunds moved into when they went up to Argyle. Of course, at that time they only had 4 children, but it still wasn't very big. Number 44 is a picture of haying at Pitt, and it is Paul Peterson sitting with his feet over the back of the rack, and Everton Grund, my brother, with him, and Grandpa up in the haystack. Number 45 is a good picture of the house that was built on Grandpa's place, and the one that I said that I found up north of I think it's north of New Colden. But you'll notice that it's got 4 gables on it, one on each end of 2 different runs. So it's quite distinctive that way, and that's how I was able to catch it going down the road. Number 46 is a picture of Axel. I'm going to Axel now. Tragically, I have almost I don't have any pictures of Ellen's family or of the Engen family. I mentioned to Annabelle when she talked to Grace, because Grace is still alive as far as I know at this time, that I would like some pictures of that family, but I just never got them. Ellen's family, I contacted her granddaughter that lives here in Oregon, and she was to send me a picture of her mother and her aunt, and she said she had one of Alfred and Ellen, but I never did receive them. So now I'm skipping clear down to Axel. We're putting her to the bottom. The first picture is him and a friend. I don't know who he is, but it's a good picture of Axel when he's quite young. Axel served in World War I in France. I have a letter that he wrote to Grandpa right after he got over there. He was in an aero squadron, believe it or not. He worked as a blacksmith. They were still pulling a lot of things around with a horse in those days. But he worked as a blacksmith in an aero squadron in France in 1918. 47 is a picture of Axel in a bowling team. It's kind of an odd one. I cut it out of a big picture. 48 is a picture of him and someone, I don't know, that they've been fishing. Axel loved to fish. Elmer Peterson was a lot the same way. In fact, they fished together a lot when they were around one another. Number 49 is a picture of Axel and his round forge in the blacksmith shop he built together with, it's not just a blacksmith shop, it was both a blacksmith shop, they had lathes, and they done woodworking also. But the hearth, the forge, of course, was Axel's baby. And he went into this partnership with Cook Brothers, and after a few years they separated partnership, and then Elmer Peterson came from Flint and went partnership with him. Elmer quit his job. When Elmer quit his job, he was like number 21 in seniority in Buick Fisher, so you know how long he had been there. But Axel was very proud of this shop, and he was an excellent blacksmith. It was a joy to watch him work with a piece of steel. I think one of his high points of his career was when he sold picaroons by the gross to Kelly Howe Thompson in Duluth, a big hardware company. And he made an excellent picaroon. It was light, at a fine point. They would break occasionally in cold weather when you hit them into a frozen stick of wood, but Axel's motto, there's a big sign up the door that says all work guaranteed, and anything you broke you brought back. The picture number 50 is of Axel and Ed in a blacksmith shop, and I think this was in Idaho, but I have no way of finding out. Nobody seems to know. I know that Ed was in Idaho at the time he got married. I'm kind of getting into Ed a little bit there, but him and Axel were very close, and quite close in age. Axel was next to youngest, and Ed was the very youngest. Okay, now we go to Ed. Picture 51 is Ed in World War I. If I have it right, Ed was born about 1898, so he would have been someplace between 18 and 20 during the war. I'm not just exactly sure the dates there, but that's close. I maybe could find out by talking to Douglas or Edmund, who I do correspond with once in a while. 52 is Axel and Elmer after a fishing party and a nice fish. 53 is Axel's wife, Irene, and this is in the little house they bought that was right next to the blacksmith shop in Badette that he owned together with Cooks. 54 is another picture of Andrew, kind of a strange picture. I don't know where he's working in the woods there someplace, most likely for Louis, but I'm not sure. Number 55 shows Ed when he was home on leave toward the end of World War II. He served in both wars. And the second one he went into it in his upper 40s, and he saw some tough service there, particularly in the Aleutians, really bad, and he lost his best friend there. It was kind of hard on him. 56 is Ed again. This was taken likewise in World War I. 57 is in World War II. And here Ed is a chief carpenter's mate, which is the rank that he got in shortly after he went in. He was in the Seabees, and that was about as high as you can go on a non-commissioned basis. 58 is where he's in the South Seas. I don't know who the man is with him. It's a bunch of the natives there. They were on a couple of different islands there. I know he spoke of one place where the Seabees had made runways that would carry 4-engine bombers in just a short time. And he was, I believe, in the Philippines at the time the war ended. 59 is another picture that I think was of Axel and Ed, and I think it was taken at that same blacksmith shop that I talked about before that was in Idaho. 60 is a picture of Ed after he was commissioned. He was a chief warrant officer, I believe, but it'd be the lower part of the commissioned officers anyway. Now I'm going backwards to pick up Anna and her family because they played a great important part in my life. Pa Peterson was a little man. I knew him never but with gray hair and curly. And he had a full head of hair yet when he died at age 83. He was not a man with a whole lot of ambition. As I get older, I think his philosophy was probably quite wise. Have enough hay for the cows, enough wood to eat, enough wood to keep the house warm, and a reasonably good place to stay. He wasn't too fussy about that either, but don't crowd life too bad. Ma was a different sort of a person, and for that reason their marriage was not the greatest. Something happened. They were married in 1902 in June, and Elma was born in 1903. And I don't know how. I know by 1908 they had left. They were in Green Acres, Washington. I have cards to that effect. There was a tragic fire. They had a homestead in the southwest corner of Rosa County, and lightning struck the barn, and they couldn't get the horses out. The horses got scared, and they couldn't get them out. It was hard on Pa, and he determined he wanted to get out of there and move someplace where they didn't have lightning. And they went out west, and he went out with his sister Annie and her husband. Now his name Leo Bankston was. They evidently went together, and they landed in Green Acres, Washington. And I think the first year they were there, Pa worked in Seattle. But sometime about this time, there evidently come conflict, I think, between Ma and Annie. And
you don't know any of that.
And anyway, Pa never contacted his family from then on for many, many, many years. In fact, he never did. Petersons went down to Parma, Idaho, and there they stayed until 1913. Shortly after Annabelle was born, they moved back to Pitt. Pa loved Idaho, and he would not have ever left there, but Ma was homesick, and she wanted to go home, and she kept on until he gave in and went. Picture 63, 61 and 62 are 61 is their wedding picture. 62 is when you see Elmer is not very old, probably 3. 63 is the farm, the house on the farm at Pitt that was built in 1918, and where I grew up in and lived until 1964. There was a porch put on there later, and then that one kind of fell to pieces, and we put on another porch after we were married. The screened-in porch you see there was took water all the time. The floor rotted. I eventually replaced the joist there and framed it in, and we used it for a bedroom, downstairs bedroom. 64 was a picture of Ma bringing the cows home before they had fences, just down below the house. I should mention too that Pa never saw his family until, I believe, 1946. This would be from 1908. Annabelle happened to be home at this time, and I'm not sure of the year. But anyway, one day Ma was reading the paper around noon, and it was the Duluth paper, and she said to Annabelle, "I wonder if this is your cousin." And it was an article written about a load of British war brides that had a contest to see who was the most handsome husband. And the one who was picked was named Mildegard Elg, and he was from Comfrey, Minnesota, and that's where Pa's sister Annie lived. So Annabelle called, and sure enough, it was the family. So they were reunited again. Pa's sister Emma lived there with her husband, and then his brother Emil lived close by in St. James. Number 65. We're in Idaho now. Here you see the big stacks of alfalfa hay, and they used a Jackson fork on those. The stacker is on the end there, and Pa always was talking about that. He just could never get Idaho out of his mind. And we were over to Idaho to a church convention here a few years ago, and there's some of those rigs still standing around there. I'm sure they haven't used them for a long, long time, but they're still standing there, some of them. But I believe that Ma is on that picture. She's one of those three ladies there in front. I don't know. Picture 66 is likewise in Idaho. Pa's on the left, and then a friend by the name of Roller Rucker is in the middle, and he talked about Roller Rucker an awful lot. Elmer standing down in front, and the one way on the right is Axel. He spent some time with him there in Idaho. 67 is Pa's two sisters and his brother Emil. Emma's on the left. She was Mrs. Elg, and then Emil, and then Annie is on the right. We did see Annie in California in 1952. Her son John brought her over to Annabelle's there. One of her sons had been one of the first aces in the Korean War. He was a pilot. 68 is a picture of Emil on the left, and then Henning Elg, who was a very nice man also, and Emma, and then Pa. 69, I couldn't let the Peterson family go without mentioning this team of mules, because they were ornery, and one of them had crowded a man in a stall and killed him, so they didn't dare to harness him, go inside him to harness him. They had to do it from across the partition. They also chased Aunt Christine one time, and she run in the barn, and she had to get out the manure hole. It was the only way she could get out. They were just plain mean. Number 70 is Pa on the right, and some good friends of his. Particularly the man standing next to him is Albert Dahlquist, and then the fellow by the name of Frank Buck and Harvey Walker. Number 70, I've got a couple of pages here for Paul and Elmer. Strangely, I don't have so many pictures of my own family, because when I was growing up, I was out at Peterson's all the time, so I have a dearth of pictures of my own family, but I think that some of my older children probably have got some pictures of my brothers. If not, I might be able to wrestle up a few odd ones and just stick in at a later time with some miscellaneous pictures. 70 is Paul and Elmer laying in front of a house that Elmer had in Flint, Michigan. 71 is Paul and Kenny Cook and a rack of fish again. Those guys were always fishing. 72 is Ma and Elmer and Pooey. That was a dog they had there at the pit for years and years and years. 73 is Elmer's Cadillac. Elmer was great to come home with a different car every time he come from there, and this was a Cadillac he had in those days, and this picture was taken out in North Dakota at Christine's place. It's Arlita and I and Buster and Elmer Christensen. 74 was a picture that was taken in 46, I think, when Elmer came home and we went on a trip up through Canada. 75 was him and a Buick he had and a deer. 76 is likewise Elmer and the dog. I don't know how come I got so many pictures of Elmer. 77 is a Rickenbacker Elmer had that he had a terrible wreck in. Almost killed himself. 78 is Elmer with the Cadillac again, and this is an important picture because in the background you see the old barn. And that barn was the house they lived on when they were first there. I don't know who had owned the place, but they didn't build that barn, and it was used as a barn clear up until I bought the place and built a new one in 47. 79 is Francis and Arleta, likewise the same trip. 80, again, we're going back to Axel and his blacksmith shop, and the one that Elmer bought into. On the left, there is Sidney Cook, and then it's Axel, and then a man by the name of Leonard Olson, and then a fellow by the name of, we called him Windy Noble. His real name was Clifford, but they called him Windy. And likewise, in picture 81 is Sid at the lathe and Windy Noble standing behind him. 82 is likewise a picture of the old farm, and I got that in there because of the barn. You'll notice that there's some boards been put up vertically on the barn roof and run over the ridge and not trimmed. Ma hated these, and she called them the fringes, and she deviled him so much about it that he never did cut them off. 83 is Ma and Pa and Joanne, Annabelle's girl. They were out visited in California when she was just tiny, but this was a picture taken when Annabelle was at home. Number 84 is a picture taken of the whole Peterson family. I would just guess about 1935. Annabelle on the left, Paul, Elmer, Ma, and Pa. Now you'll notice that Ma has written her name as J-A-G, which would be Yug, or me. And I think this is a picture that she had sent to her aunt, Mrs. Amanda Anderson out here, and that Annabelle got back after great aunt died. 84 is I got two 84s, but number 284 is Ma and her geese. They were very tame. 86 is Pa painting the gable in the house when he was, I believe, it would have been 1952, which had been 3 years before he died. So he was about 81. 87 is a picture taken on their 50th wedding anniversary. Paul. 86 is a picture of that I got from Albie, and she says it is Paul Peterson holding me on Bert Lee's colt. I never saw that picture until just one of the last times I was in Minnesota before, when Albie was still alive. 87 is Paul with the old horse Nellie that came from the farm down on the prairie, was one of Grandpa's horses. And in the background is the little shack that John Erickson had, and after he left, Pa moved it over and used it as a granary, and Paul used it as his first house. Number 88 is Paul and a man by the name of Marvin Johnson and a wind sled he built, or they built it together there at the place. He had an awful time with that. There wasn't a very big spindle engine. One time he cranked and cranked and cranked, and finally opened the throttle wide open, and he went out and cranked her, and she started. And she went across the ditch and out into the brush and ruined the propeller. Sid Cook tried to make him another one, but it didn't work very good. Number 89 is another hunting picture, and both Paul and Kenny Cook are likewise on that picture. Kenny Cook is on the left and Paul is on the right. Number 90 is a hunting picture. Now, this was during hunting season, like the 15th of November. They were parked down below the hill because they couldn't get out the regular road to the north. Number 91 is Francis, and looks like a Model T. I'm sure it's a Model T Ford, but I don't think Elmer ever had a Model T, but she had that old 22. I believe Leslie Peterson still has this 22, and it's a chipmunk or something she got. And number 92 is a picture of Elmer in a little race car he had in Michigan someplace. 93 is the picture of Paul. I don't know what he's doing up on top of there, but this is Travelese Trailer Company in Minneapolis. This body shop there that he was working for done all the spraying, the varnishing, and Paul done the varnishing for that. He went back there and worked another year or two in the wintertime, and the guy got to partying and playing around with the girls that worked there, and didn't turn in taxes and stuff, and went broke, and Paul had to cough up the money for his income taxes besides Social Security too. 94 is Leslie, and that's by a truck that Johnny Pettit drove at that time for Riverview Laundry. Number 95 is Paul and Annabelle on the lower side, and Hildy Olson on the top, on stilts. Number 97 is Evelyn crowning on a pair of stilts, and Leslie is right there. Number 96 is a bug that Paul made out of a 28 Chevrolet. Had 2 transmissions in it, so it would gear down pretty low. And a girl by the name of Carol Fuller's in the driver's seat. Okay, now I'm going to go a little while to the Hugberg family. This first picture here, number 48, is of the whole family. I can't remember Andrew's name, but him and his wife sit in front. And then starting from left to right is Emil, who died in World War I. Augusta, who became Mrs. John Johnson. Number 3 is Robert Hugberg, and he married and had several children. Likewise, John Johnson's did. Number 4 is, oh darn, I forget her name always. Hilda. She married Willer, and she took Verona a fair amount of time. Number 5 is Arthur, and Arthur was married to a Johnson likewise, so Augusta's children and Arthur's children were double cousins. Number 6 is Ethel. She never married. She was a nurse. Number 7 is my mother, Amelia, and old man's name was Andrew. They came over to and landed in Pennsylvania, in eastern Pennsylvania, and that's where my mother was born. And she was just, they had just come from Sweden at the time. I think she was probably the oldest of the family, or at least probably the next to the oldest. It could be that Emil was older. I have a picture that I'm going to bring in later that I think shows my first picture of me. I think it's my mother is carrying me. I'm not sure at the time. But she is pregnant with somebody, and of Alton's age, it almost certainly has to be me. Number 99 is the Hugberg girls. My mother is on the left. And then it would be Augusta, Hilda, the tall one, and Ethel sitting down by my mother. Picture number 100 is the 3 boys. There was likewise would be Emil on the left, Robert in the middle, and Arthur on the right. 101 is Ethel, again the nurse. 102 is Arthur and Elvira on their 50th wedding anniversary, and 103 is Hilda. I can't remember Willer's name, but anyway, Mr. and Miss Willer. I have another picture of them I hope to get in here. I have mislaid that picture of Mr. and Mrs. Ted Willer and their 2 children and Verona. I wanted that picture particularly bad because Verona is on there, and she spent quite a bit of her young life at that house. They kept her quite a bit of the time. I think until she was about a freshman or a sophomore in high school, she came back home. She must have been at least a sophomore. She would be home in the summers and stay there in the winter. I believe that. You know, I can't really remember that, but I could find that out from Verona. But I believe she stayed there the 9 months of the year. Quite a while until she was at that age. She went to school at Pitt, some at the start. I should really talk to her about that. I cannot find that picture now. I had it. Leola sent it to me. I laid it somewhere yesterday, and Vivian is going to help me try and look. I've searched the place over. I've just mislaid it somewhere. I'm starting now with some pictures of my young life, and I hope that you intercede with your mother to get her to do the same thing for her young life, because you have pictures of us when we're older, but this is when we're just kids. Picture 104 is probably the first picture that was taken of me out by the east side of the house in Pitt. 105 is not much later, but I think a little bit later, and you can see that it looks quite barren off to the north there. Just those 2 big spruce trees, which are both gone now. 106 is a picture I don't know where it come from. They tell me that's a man by the name of Gardner McGuire. I don't understand him holding me, but they say that it is me. I don't recognize the dog either. 107 looks like I'm about 2.5 or 3. 108, I'm probably 6 or 7. That dog there, and she also appears in 109, is a dog that Paul brought home from Flint. She was of the same derivative as the police force dogs there in Flint. And she liked chickens. I finally had to get rid of her, but she was a very pretty dog. On 108, you'll see Dorns standing to the left of Ma, and likewise out in front of the house. You'll notice on page 104 there is just a bare siding on the house, and then picture 108, they put roofing shingles over the top of it. 109 also Paul's 1926 Chrysler. When Paul worked in Flint, he would pretty much always come home with a different car. I think that picture 110 is likewise the same car, and me standing on a box, and I like this picture because to me it looks like Little John did when he was young. 111 is a picture of me on the back of a sheep. Some of the prairie folks, I believe it was Turnlands, gave us that sheep, and we raised it as a bottle lamb, and he got enormous. The dog's name is Duke. Notice how small the trees look there, and particular on, it's even more pronounced on some of the other pictures. I don't have them on this sheet, but they'll be coming along soon. You'll see that the trees there out east of the old house were just little fellas. Picture 112 was taken in 1932. I would have been 7. 112 is just this girl by the name of Burl Murdoch, that her father was deep wages in Pitt, and they left Pitt. I believe her mother had died. And every so often he would write Ma and say, I'm sending Burl down for the summer or something like that, and she stayed with us several summers. This was a particularly bad one because in the spring of 1932, Ed Grund lost his job, and he had to get out of, there was no unemployment or anything like that in those days, so he came up with his family and they lived with us all summer. And so those are, in front of Burl is Edmund Grund, right behind her is me, and then Douglas is right behind. And if you look close down on the right-hand side, you'll see Hilda Norquist just kind of sticking his head in there. 114 is my cousin, Dolores Christensen, and I out at Wheeler's Point in the old days. 115, I'm a little older, and 116, about this age, maybe a little older. I think that I was like 10 or 11 when I had this dog. It's named Jerry. And I was dressed the way I was to school. You see, I have a pair of boots with high socks and mittens and a jacket. And then this time I had a helmet. We never did have parkas in those days. I don't know how come in that cold country. 117, I was a sophomore in high school. I went to school steady for several months this time, and I got up to 165 pounds, which I never realized again until I was in my high 50s. 119 is a calf that I got. Pa finally allowed me to have a calf once in a while, and that became mine, and I was able to sell it. This is really a pretty little calf. It's a cross between Shorthorn and Hereford. It was a roan white face. But now you can see the trees are much bigger. I imagine that at this time I was about that same age, and they're 15 or 16. 118 is my class when I was in the 5th grade. There are 3 of us there in front that were in the 5th grade. Myself, and immediately to my right is Buck Bowman, and right next to him is Boogie Passy. Boogie was, his name was Francis. We always called him Boogie because he was so big and strong, all the rest of us were scared of him. But anyway, that was the class, and that was our teacher, Florence Krause. She taught us for 4 years. She started teaching before she was 20, and she played ball with us every day when it was fit weather to play. She could hit the ball farther than any of the rest of us. 124. It's actually 120 is Vernon and my father and I. 43 in September. Vernon was home for just 3 days in all the time he was in the Army. And this was on the Saturday. He drove around to see a lot of the neighbors. He stayed Sunday, and Monday morning he left and decided that when he got to World that if things went right he could make another day, and he got off the bus and went over to the depot, and the depot agent got him a ride back to Pitt on the freight, and so he stayed another day. It was a very short time and very precious to us all. 121 is Doran and Vernon and Paul standing out in front of what is now a great big clump of basswood they are. Vivian remembered it. The trees are still there today now in 2003, and it's an enormous clump there. It's right on the north side of Douglas's house. You can see they're kind of clowning, they're all laughing, and evidently Doran and Paul both got sweaters, I think, for Christmas that are alike. 126 is me again when I'm quite young with a little kiddie car. Now we call them kiddie cars in those days, and I'm not so sure but what Paul didn't make that for me, but it could have been bought. But Paul was good to make things for me. 123 is the old K coming down the road with a big load of tamarack wood. And I have another picture of that I hope to get in here someplace. And there must be, on a load like that, there's almost enough wood there to last a family over a winter, over a year. That's an enormous load of wood. Number 124, I'm talking on the phone. I think they said I was talking to Mrs. Burtley. I don't know why, but anyway, I was imagining. I had a great imagination. Behind in the background, you'll see turkeys, which at this time most every farmer had a few turkeys. And come fall, and they'd go from one place to the next just like thrashing. They'd start maybe at Colotte's, and then they went to Lee's, and then to Jack Olson's, and then to Norquist, and then to our place. And everybody went, and everybody helped. And some of them had more, and some had less, but it was all just free labor. And they were shipped to a company by the name of Fox that bought them out of Chicago. They were shipped to Chicago on the train. 125 was just a picture of Dorn and Audrey when they were first married, or maybe even before I was married. 126 is me with a little hay rack. I know Paul made the hay rack. The wagon wheels I most likely were purchased. And that's my dog, my cat, Pussin. And like I say, Paul was great to make things for me as a kid. And I was pretending I was hauling hay and putting up hay. 127 is just another baby picture. Number 128 is a picture taken up at Paul Peterson's place. Pa's got the lines. Paul is standing in front, and the man on the other side is William Peterson, the minister that spent a lot of time there, and he was great to get out and help. They're hauling wood, and that's the way wood was normally hauled in the wintertime. You see the bobsleighs, and I think my own boys know how they worked, how they were just like a center articulating tractor. They steered the same way. And that was a pretty good sized load there for a team because it's green wood. It's called a split. 129 shows the house that Paul and they lived in. The first year they lived in just the back part of it. And I've told this story to a lot of people. Paul built that little, I think it was 8 by 10, that little portion that sticks out in the front there. And Evelyn was just ecstatic. I'd never seen a woman happier over any new house in my life than she was over getting that little kitchen so she could get her. She had an old cupboard. That was, in those days the cupboards weren't built in, and she got her kitchen stove out in there and left some room in the living room. 131 is a picture of Anna Grund Peterson when she was 16 years old. This was about the time she got married. She was I think they got married in June. I think her birthday was in February, so she was just 16 in a few months when they were married. 130 is taken of me on a beautiful fall day, like it can be in Minnesota, and on the horse Florid. I thought she was a great horse at that time. She really was a lousy horse to ride because she couldn't hardly run. She was quite spavined. I don't know, something was wrong with her legs. 132 is a picture that my young life would not be complete without. That's my K7 truck I bought and paid cash for in 1946. This would be in the winter of 46. It looked nice. I still think it's a nice looking truck. It had a special paint job, I think. I believe the wheels were red, the fenders and the running boards were black. And then from there up to the bending part of the hood and an equal part on the door, it was red. And then there was a black streak that separated the red at the bottom from the white on the top, and the whole top was white. It's a nice looking truck, and I had ridden back from Minneapolis on that truck one time when it was still on the transfer, and I thought it was a great truck, and I was really tickled to have it. Had 9-inch tires most of the trucks around that were hauling pulpwood only had 8 1/4. It had a 3-inch spring. A lot of the other smaller trucks, if you loaded on 4 quarters of wood, the spring, the frame rub went right down and bumpers hit the axle. But this one here, you still had some spring left. Had this truck for 17 years. Never let me down the road. Never left home, but didn't take me back. I thought I should devote a whole file folder to Vernon, because he never married, never had any children, so there's nobody to keep mention of him in the future. Vernon was a little different than the rest of us, I think. Seemed to me like he was anyway. He was more of a loner. Sometimes the boys would be out in camp cutting wood, and he would stay out over the weekend, stay out there by himself. One time he shot him loose. Another time he chopped his foot, cut a cord to a toe that had been giving him a terrible trouble. It was one of those, I don't know what they call them, but the toe bent in the middle and stood up straight where it hit his sole of his shoe, and it gave him a lot of trouble. Anyway, he done himself a good favor there. The toe straightened out. But he loved to hunt and fish, and he was a great guy for ideas. In the spring, he would often take a gunny sack over his shoulder, and he would take a spear, and he'd leave in the morning, and you wouldn't see him till night. He'd walk up and down the creeks. Vernon made a boat, the first boat we ever had. He made it in the barn. Him and Roger built a trailer house. I maybe should have put that. I got a picture of that dumb thing. I should have put it here. It was enormously heavy, but they made it really tight. And Vernon pretty near died in it. It had a stove that burned kerosene, and they had the dumb thing so tight that Bernie woke up and he felt funny, and he lit a match, and then the match went out, and then he realized there was no air left in the trailer house. So he got up and opened the door. So they had to bore a hole in the floor to have an oxygen supply. He made a little turning lathe once. It wasn't very much of a turning lathe, but I know one thing he was able to make on it was spear poles. Yes, he did like to go fishing in the spring. And he also made a machine, had an old, we didn't have any money, you know, and there was nothing to do with, and he made an ice cutting machine out of an old stationary engine. Put some runners on it and took the saw off, and the buzz saw that they used to cut up wood, and you were able to pull this, and it sawed ice a lot faster. He was just full of things like this that he did. And about 1938, I'm not sure when, I wish I knew for certain, but maybe it was 39, he saved up a little money from working someplace, and he decided to go west. He'd always wanted to do this. I think Axel probably fueled that in him, because Axel always talked a lot about the West. He had enough to buy a bus ticket out west and still have enough to live on a while, but he thought he would hitchhike and save some money. Well, it turned out the other way. It took him longer. A few guys loaned money from him, and he got out here almost broke. He got down to the place where he split wood for his meals at one time, here in Portland, Oregon. He eventually got on backsloping ditches on a road by hand. And I believe the name of the company was McNutt, but I don't know why that comes to my mind. You know, it's many, many years ago. Anyway, from there he went to work in the shipyards. They were just opening up here right prior to the start of the war. And he went to work there, and he persuaded Dorn to come out. And then after Dorn worked for a while, Vernon went into the Air Force, and he encouraged Dorn to go to college. So Dorn enrolled at Oregon State as a preliminary to engineering course, and Vernon went into the Air Force. I think this was in 1942 in the fall, or I don't know what time it was, but I believe it was 1942 that he got into the Air Force. He had an awful time. He tried to get into the Coast Guard, he tried to get into the Navy. The Navy said his legs had been broke several places. It had never happened, but Vernon had abused himself pretty bad. And I remember one time he was trimming a piece of a pulpwood stick on the dray, and it was frozen, and the axe slipped and went in alongside of his shin, and it was pretty serious. But Vernon wasn't one to fuss about things like this, and it probably looked on the x-ray like a break. Anyway, he didn't make it. And the way he got into the Air Force was, there were a couple things about him and his career in the Air Force that was very similar to oh, I can't think of that man's name, Chuck Yeager. Number one, they both didn't have much education. Yeager had a high school. Vernon just had 8th grade. And when you went in, he went in as a fighter pilot where you got your own, to be your own navigator, and this was hard for him because in pre-flight. But I'm getting ahead of my story now. Both he and Yeager had very little education. They both had to get letters of recommendation from people in the community. And Bernie got Dr. Onstead, and I believe it was Walter Orr, the banker, and I think there's one more, I don't know, but those letters Verona still has. I hope I can get some copies of them. Anyway, he got in, and they sent him first out to eastern Oregon, around Ontario, to see can this man fly a plane. So they taught him to fly in a Piper Cub. And I don't know whether it was during a training mission or when he went up on his first solo. The engine had been overhauled, and somebody had left a piece of rope laying on it. And when they were up in the air, it caught fire. And I believe they had to land dead. But of course, with a dead engine. But of course, those things took off and landed at about 40 miles an hour. They're a very safe airplane, and this wasn't difficult. It was a little scary, maybe. From here, he went to pre-flight. Pre-flight was in Santa Ana, and this is the only place Vernon had a struggle. There was a lot of, this was strictly bookwork, and because of his going in as a fighter pilot, math and algebra and trigonometry were in that course, and at one time he almost got what they call washed out, but the washboard gave him another chance, and he made it. From there, he went to what is now Chino, but at that time was Ontario, California. And there he took his basic training. Picture number 136 shows that. The trainer there, and in the background, every pilot that went into the Air Force in World War II trained in this airplane. A great plane, and in this picture is two of Vernon's friends, and the instructor in the middle, John Walker. Walker was an exceptional pilot, but he was no good for the military because he had a sinus problem of some sort and he could not stand altitude. So he taught Vernon a lot of things, and some of them he put him through maneuvers that he really wasn't supposed to, but he said, I want to show you every circumstance you can possibly get into so that you'll never have to worry about not knowing how to get out of it. They done what they call inverted loops and inverted spins, where in place of the pressure being against your seat, it's against your belt. Other things too, but I can't just recall them now. Anyway, I went to an air museum a few years ago, and when I got in there, I seen the Cal Aero sign up there, and I thought, I believe this is where Gurney took classes. And so I found out that it was the same place, and I took some of Vernon's pictures back. And so if you ever go to that museum, you might see them. They're slug at the pictures on the wall of old veterans. His next stop was at War Eagle Field in Lancaster, and this was in the BT-13s, that picture 137. This is the plane he later instructed at when he was an instructor. It wasn't nearly the plane that the AT-6 was, which is picture 138, and his training in that he really enjoyed. That was a great airplane. He graduated from Rootfield, Arizona. This is another thing he had in common with Chuck Yeager. Both graduated from Rootfield, and likewise they were both trained in P-39s. Yeager was trained in P-39s just prior to being sent overseas, and there, of course, he flew P-51s. Vernon was trained in P-39s and had just completed his training here in Oregon when he crashed, so he never got overseas. After he was commissioned and graduated and got his officer's uniform, like picture 133, he was home for 3 days. And then he reported to Randolph Field, Texas, and there he took a course in instructing. And there's a picture here of a BT-13 landing in the wet in Randolph Field. Bernie said they were quite treacherous. On the back of the picture is written, this was treacherous, but he said this guy wasn't going quite fast enough to make a good picture, but he said they were fun. When he came home in 1943 in September, he flew as far as Minneapolis. And on that plane, he met a girl by the name of Elvira Lundeen, and she is picture 134. They corresponded quite regularly from then on. This was in September until May. And judging from the letters that we have, I think Nona still has these letters, it sounded like she was about to come out here and meet him. Doran and Mildred did go and see her once afterwards. But of course, Bernie was gone by this time. 135 is taken the day of the funeral. I'm so sorry that my father wasn't on this picture. But I think in case there's people that don't know everybody on here, that here's this recording. From left to right, Doran. Lieutenant Leonard Boyd that brought Vernon's ashes back. Mildred, right behind Mildred is John. Next to Mildred is Everton. Behind Everton is Alton. In front is Verona, and in the back row is Paul. Vernon, we've heard afterwards that Vernon took off from, he had taken some training here right in Portland. He was so pleased to be up here because he knew people, and he was able to visit them a little bit. Though he couldn't understand in the war that the courses were very, I can't say the word I want to, but businesslike. There was no monkeying around, no waiting or anything like that. He finished the training here, and they were going to ferry the planes back to Sacramento, California. And just out of Portland, he crashed. Everybody feels that had anything to do with it, that he had a heart attack, because he was flying the fifth man in the five-man formation. They never heard a word from him. The pilot in the fourth plane just happened to turn around, and Vernon was gone. Years later, Pete Klimek called Everton or Alton in. There's something wrong bothering him. And he told him that he had been playing cards in Honolulu with some officers, and that they had told him that when they found out he was from Vedette, why they told him about a young officer that took off out of Portland and got up in the air and asked for permission to come in and land because he wasn't feeling good, and they denied the permission. Now, as I think back of it, it's very likely that he had what we'd consider a bellyache that he didn't realize was his heart. And of course, it was wartime again, and things were very uptight, and they didn't grant the permission. Anyway, he crashed and burned. It was the 12th of May, 1944, a day I'll never forget. I had one more thing I wanted to tell about Vernon. I think these loads of wood that you see, I'm pretty sure that was Bernie's engineering. That was very like him. Also, when he was breaking land, Paul Peterson told about one time when he was going through the rough country with the cat. It was so rough, and he was going so fast it threw him clear off the cat, and he ran along beside and slid back on again and kept on going. My recorder is kind of bothering here, so I'll have to change tapes. I want to add just a little bit more. There were three things that he had in common with Yeager. Number one, that they had little education and had to get letters signed. Number two, that they trained in the 39s. No, I forgot the third one. They completed their course in Lukefield, Arizona. But Vernon accepted on the cover sheet, I've put a picture of P-39, which is the plane he was flying when he crashed. Quite a unique airplane, and if any of you ever get to the Pima Air Museum outside of Tucson, Arizona, they have one there. Actually, it's a P-63. Very little difference. The biggest difference was they had a supercharged engine. P-39 was not that great an airplane, but it seemed like now when I hear that Yeager trained in them, they must have used them to to train people before they sent them overseas in the better planes. It was pretty good at low level, and the Russians got a lot of them and used them well to strafe, and it had a pretty fair cannon in the nose, which was it was a 37 millimeter, and so they used them as an anti-tank weapon, I believe. Anyway, they have one there in the Pima Museum that has been specially redone to show the uniqueness of the plane. As you look at the plane, you'll notice that the exhaust pipes are immediately behind the pilot, and that's where the engine's set, right behind the pilot. The 12-cylinder B12. The same engine was in the P-38s and the P-40s, but in the P-38s they were supercharged like the P-63 was. Anyway, that one they have there in Tucson has got plexiglass down the left side of the plane. So you can stand out there and see the engine, see the shaft that drove the prop that went right between the pilot's legs. Even the stick come up off the floor, and it had a loop in it where that shaft drove. And then it drove. You can see how the armament is up in the nose, the cannon and everything. Quite an unusual ship. And there's another one likewise at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, where he trained in his basic training. There's another place to have. They have a wonderful supply there, and I'm sure that they have. I know at least two more places where they'd have them. One is in the Fighter Museum in Phoenix, and then in the big Air Force Museum in Columbus, Ohio. I had some trouble with the last tape before I changed this. I've done about everything I could wrong. I started on one tape, and then in place of turning it over, playing the other side, I started on the second tape. Well, the second tape I got a little smarter and got both sides playing, but towards the end, for some reason, it got a slack in there. So when I went to take it out, it made a loop, and had an awful time with it, and I'm going to try and see if I can wind it. But I got to have some help to do that. I might have to do that one all over again. I'm going to talk a little bit about this picture now, 140. That was taken on the day of Louis' funeral. And all of us, the whole 8 of us, are left there. And I want to talk a little bit about each one. Roger is on the left. Roger was probably the most like my father of any of the family. And he was a great trapper. In the old days, trapping was quite a thing in the 30s, because the #1 extra large dark mink would bring $30 or more, and that was a whole man's wages for a month for a man. He worked in the woods and stuff with Bernie a lot, and then in 1942 he was drafted. He went into the Army, and this was not long after the war broke out, and they just hardly landed in Fort Snelling, and they just shipped him off by rail to Florida, and from there they got on a ship and went to Panama. They were worried about Japanese attack on Panama, and they spent some very serious time there for about 6 or 8 months making gun emplacements. And Roger worked himself up to first sergeant, which is as high as you can go without being commissioned. And then he came home, and then he kind of decided to go farming. Louis gave him an 80 that was, or 80 or 120 acres. It was west off McCarp Road, south of Badette, and then that wasn't really a viable farm. There wasn't so much open on it, so he bought the John Kumala place and farmed. And then farming got tough, and he went back to working in road construction. He had worked for the county, running a TD-18 a few years before he went into the Army. And at that time, he was with George Iott a lot, and they used a mucker, what they call a mucker, or an elevating grader, to build a road. And they sometimes, 3 men could build a fair road a mile long in a week. Anyway, after a while he had to go back, and he got in with a man by the name of, his first name was Joe anyway. Some of the Grund boys, Alton's boys, would be able to tell you what his last name was, or Rogers, either one. He had married Emma Sindler, who was Albie's sister, so there's double cousins there, Alton. Anyway, he went to work for this man down around south of Grand Forks on the Minnesota side. And he worked himself up to a foreman there, and then he decided to go on his own. He first bought an old D8, and he overhauled it completely and made it really nice. And then the next summer he bought a D6, and Gary went to work for him. And from there he was able to add a little machinery and then finally get bond, and he went into the road building business, which he stayed at until he died. He had a bad heart attack. I believe they were working a road down around Brainerd someplace, and he had a bad heart attack there. And then he was able to get back to work, and he lived for a couple, 3 more years, and he hired Dorn to go to work for him as foreman. His children are scattered all over. You people probably know more of that than I do. The next one on the picture, going from left to right, is me, and then Verona stands in front of me. Verona, I talked to her this morning, so I didn't make mistakes about this, but I found out that she did live with Ted Willers most of the time, from the time she was 6 until she was 16. She came home sometimes in the summer and sometimes at Christmas time, and but she lived at Willers most of the time, and so she's quite close to Leola and her brother, but mostly Leola still is. Next is Doran. Doran fell when he was a small boy in the old house down on the west side by the sawmill, and he fell downstairs, and we don't know if he hurt himself then or he had a terrible fever not long afterwards. They think he might have had polio, but after a while anyway they realized that his left arm was not right, and it grew in length, but it had almost no muscle on it, and the fingers were curled in his hand. So this was for him quite a drawback, but he didn't let it bother him. He had a lot of grit, and he done everything around. He run cat, and he drove truck, whatever, he could do it. And he, when things got a little bit not so good for Dad toward the end of the 50s, he took off with some young fellows and went up to Alaska. And it was a bad time, and he got a chance to get on a cat there once, and they sent him down the mud hole, and he got stuck, and that was the end of it. So he came back feeling kind of low. And Moose Olson, can't remember his real name, but he had been a friend of the family, and his parents were a friend of our family from way down the prairie. He wanted him to come and go to work for Craig. Craigs were the biggest blacktoppers in the state, and Moose was working for him. And Dorn went down there, and he first got on a TD-18, which was heavy on the steering clutches, and of course the left hand that Dorn had to work them, and he was having an awful time. And the governor broke on the machine, and they put him on a D7, and that was just the opposite. It was a very operator-oriented tractor, and he done well. And then about 2 or 3 years, he was their top man on the cat. I talked with a man that was working in the pit one day, and he said he didn't know why, but Dorn could always move more gravel and day than anybody else. After a little bit, Roger was needing a foreman, and he persuaded Dorn to come and work for him, and so Dorn did. And then Roger died suddenly short after that, and so they got Dorn as acting superintendent, and he done the bidding and everything, and then he died suddenly at age 48, left with 2 children. Next in the picture then is Mildred, and I think you all know Mildred's story, but just in case you don't, I want to go over it. When my mother died, there were 9 children. I was the 9th, and Mildred was not quite 16. We also had the telephone office. Mildred was away down at my grandfather's in Warren, Minnesota, going to school, and she came home and took over the running of the household and the raising of the family. Except me, that was too much. The baby was too much. But Dorn was only 3, Verona was 5. And the next year Verona left and went down, so that lightened the load some. But she had the whole responsibility of the family there in those Depression times when money was really short. And I guess she kind of thwarted my dad's hope of getting remarried. He had a girlfriend that he was going with, and Mildred told me just one of the last times I saw her that she kind of put the kibosh to this because she thought it was too soon after Mama had died, and And then she stayed there, and Louis never got married for 20 years, which to me was a double tragedy because she denied herself and he was denied. Frank, she married this Frank Sindler, and Frank was a wonderful man and wonderfully patient. And they were engaged when I started to go to school in 1931, and they didn't get married until 1945. And they had the two children, Bonita and Ray was killed right out in front of the house when he was 9, which was another terrible shock. Bonita was valedictorian in school when she graduated, and at that time Vernon Rogers' boy was salutatorian in the same class. Next is Everton. He was the oldest of the boys. Oh, here is a big blank place now. Like that. I think that his philosophy was a little bit like Pa Peterson's. Everton wasn't one to want to have a whole lot, but he was content with a little bit less. And what he done nice. He was a good mechanic, but he never had the push to go out and do this as a living. He eventually got that little tract of land where him and Mary lived. Mary and him must have got married about 1940, I believe, and they had the two children. And he was content to live on that little place, and Mary is still there and still content. I think that was a great character trait of those two, that they were content in that place, and I wish we more could be that way. Everett and Mary were very nice to me, come and visit us, I think more than any of the family after we were married. And I say I'm sorry that I didn't appreciate him like I should. Standing right in front of Everton, Everton is Paul. Paul was the thinker of the family. Always wanted to go to school. He went to high school down at Warren. There was no chance to go to high school in Baudette at that time. Dorn was the first one to be able to go to high school in Baudette, and he walked about 2 miles to catch the bus the first years he went. But Paul was always the thinker, and kind of slow and methodical. Louis managed to get him into a little bit of junior college. He stayed with Ed in Virginia, and then he went into the Army towards the tail end of the big war. And then after he got out, he went to college on the GI Bill, and he became an electrical engineer. He went to work for a firm in Jackson, Michigan, Commonwealth Associates. They were a consultant engineers. And work got short there, and then he came out west and went to work on a kind of a government project in Chico, California. I think I forgot to tell you that after Vernon graduated from and was commissioned, that I did mention in my talk about him that he went to Randolph Field, Texas after graduation and took training there. Well, he went up to Chico and instructed in basic training. I believe he took 2 classes through before they started training him in P-39. Anyway, Paul landed in Chico, and he worked there on missile silos for a year or 2, and that job disappeared, and he went up to Seattle and worked for Boeing for a while. And then they called him back to Commonwealth, and he stayed there until he retired. Tragedy of Paul was that he got overtaken with booze. As long as I'm talking on this respect, I mention Ed in the same light. My Uncle Ed was a very brilliant man. Somehow or another he got to be a kind of an engineer. I know he wasn't a registered engineer, but he held engineering jobs as like assistant city engineer of that. Always was a neat person, and he was great to draw and looked always dressed nice. But he got a little bit overtaken with booze, and then when he went into the Second War, it was terrible hard on him, and after that he was in bad shape. He came up to Axel's funeral, and he was out of a job. And so he asked my father if he could come out there and stay. And Louis said, yes, if you don't drink, that'll be fine with me. So Ed came out there, and while he was there building a porch, and I brought some hogs down for my dad to have in camp, butchered hogs, and Ed fell dead out there in front of the porch. Axel died on Halloween night, and Ed died on Armistice Day, just 11 days apart. Now I got off my story, but now I'm getting to Alton. Alton was probably the closest of my brothers. But Alton and I guess, were probably both at fault in that neither one of us ever confided any personal things. No personal problems ever entered into our conversation. We worked together a lot, and I enjoyed Alton's children a lot. We worked together with them a great deal, and I worked with Alton more than any. We had some of our farm machinery together, and the last years we worked together in the woods. And so I was very close to him. Alton got married when he was quite young, I believe 23, and I think Albie was 17. I was thinking she was 16, but I believe she was 17. No, but it really doesn't matter anyway. They were both quite young, and times were hard. And at first they lived with Creviers, and then they went up to the old Paul Thompson place. And I've saved a picture here of the bug because it shows that place up there. And I'm going to label that picture number 144, because I want to talk just a little bit about it now. Not only is the old Paul Thompson place on that picture, and the old bug, the rear end of that bug come out of this old school bus. And in the background you can see the house, and on the side there is a Model A Ford that Peterson's had, that Ma bought, and Adrian Perrier had it at this time. I want to talk a little more about Nona now. Picture 141 shows Verona and Vivian and myself and Mildred and Helmer. This was taken at Lake Louise up in Canada. Verona's marriage to Adrian was not a happy one. They had 5 children, and eventually she divorced him, and then she married Helmer, who had courted her way back before she was married. And they had a few good years together, and then Helmer's health got really poor. He was legally blind when they got married, and he had diabetes, and he couldn't hear, and lots of things. But then it got so that she just couldn't care for him anymore. He would fall, and she couldn't get him up, and so she had to put him in a rest home there. And Vivian and I were up to see him once after we got there. But this particular time when this picture was taken, Mildred was up there visiting, and Vivian and I went up missing. And then we took a little trip. We went west from Edmonton to Jasper, and then down through the Canadian Rockies, which is a very beautiful drive to where this picture was taken in Lake Louise. Where do you want to put that? Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't stick up there.
Picture 145 is likewise of that same bug. And the reason I took that picture, that there's so many people on there that you might identify with. Standing on the kind of the running board, like right in front of the wheel, is Gary when he was just a little tyke, and right next to him is Victor Sorensen. Vic was an old Dane that worked for Dad a lot. He worked in the sawmill. He was tail sawyer, very hot-tempered, but very jolly when he was feeling good. Then the little guy looking up is Dennis, and right behind Dennis is Doran with the stocking cap on, and Paul is driving. Picture 146 and 147 are taken when they were building the road, Highway 11, through Pitt. Now, I don't know what year this would be. It would have been after the 1910 fire, that's for sure, but it was not so very long after. That road was in use until 1932, when the present highway was built. 148 is a picture of an army tank that Paul bought after the war. He had big hopes of clearing land with it, but the track was not a good track for that, so it kind of fizzled out. Finally sold it for the engine, and I hauled it down. I hauled it home from Minneapolis originally, and then I hauled it down on the Iron Range. The guy who bought it there was had an aircraft engine in it, and pulling it as an old 2236. That was the biggest tractor to go on in the early 30s. 149 is a picture I just stuck in because there's some people that look so much like themselves on that picture. On the left is Dorn, of course, and that's the way he looked when he came back from college in Oregon and went back to work for Dad again. He dressed like that, and it's so typical of him. And Alton, of course, and Gary is probably, what would you say, 3 years old, so it's probably about 1940. And it's a great picture of Mildred. And the other lady is Evelyn Anderson. The Anderson place was east of Pitt a mile, and then south about a quarter of a mile, and off east again. One of the older, that place was inhabited early, and after Andersons left, I never knew them myself, but there were so many different families lived there. Number 150 is the house that Ma and Pa had on the little irrigated acreage of Parma, Idaho. We took them back there. I took them back there in 1951. We went down to the old place, and Pa got out and went in. Ma had been there previously once, but this was Pa's first trip back since he left. And that's Elmer out there pushing that little carriage, and who the other kids are I don't know. Must be neighbor boys. 151 is the old house, the old Peterson house where I was raised and where we had our children were all born when we were there. I like that picture there very much. A lot of people lived in that house. Ed lived there summer several different times, and other people were taken in and sheltered there. 152 is the four generations, Ma and Elmer and Arlita with Grandpa. Don't know when that picture was taken, but Arlita was, it looks to me like she's about 3, so that would have been about 1928 or 29 in that area. Number 155 is a picture taken of Jack Olson's house. Now, I don't know how many of you know Jack Olson, but anyway, Jacks were quite well-to-do people in Sweden, and Jack came here when he was probably in his 30s, I would just guess the way it sounds to me. And certainly then after a while, why Hilda and Svea and Hilding came. You can imagine what it was for a come-down for her to move from an upper-crust place in Sweden to this. This was their house at that time. Mrs. Olson, Hilda, is sitting in the back left corner of the pickup of the car, and next is Ma, and the girl sitting up is their daughter Svea, and then Hilding is sitting in the passenger side, and it's John Erickson's car, and he's driving. Now, John Erickson is the man that homesteaded the place that Paul Peterson had for many years, right across the road from the Peterson house. Number 154 is a wedding cake that Kenneth Christensen made for Ma and Pa on their 50th wedding anniversary. Now, this cake was made in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and sent by rail up there, and you'll see there is not a chip on it. What he done, he put some icing on a piece of cardboard, and then he set the cake on that. The cake, of course, had a cardboard underneath it, and they stuck together with the icing. And then he put a box around it, and he put cellophane over the top so that people could see it. He handled it with care. And I had several cakes sent up there. He made a wedding cake for us. He was a great friend of mine. Right below that picture of the cake is a picture of the first year I met Kenneth, and a deer he got. Actually got 2 right there that time. We were coming back in, and there was a doe and a buck there, went across the road, and he got them both. I think Paul got a bullet in one of them too. But this is straight south of Grayson, straight south of where the dump is now in year 2000. Kenneth was a great hunter. I met him that year, and I hunted with him. I corresponded with him. He went into the Army right after this, and he was shipped over to India. And there he spent most of the war. They're right at the place where they were flying goods over the hump to China, and he was right at the base station there. He was a great hunter and a wonderful man, and we were great friends. He was a fair amount older than me. He got married, and that caused kind of a separation. His wife was a little different, but I kept track of him, and he sold me that rifle. I just had an old .32-40 that was all shot out, and the next year he wrote me a letter and said, if you want my gun, you can have it for $65. That was, at the time of this picture, the gun was brand new. It's a Model 70 Supergrade 3006. I still have it, and I hope one of my boys will want to have it.
Worth well more than $600.
It's worth a bunch of money nowadays. Anyway, he made our wedding cake too, which was grand, but our cameras we borrowed a color camera, and it had a filter on it, so we didn't get any decent pictures. Number 153 is my first enterprise, and it was a bad one. Bought this old truck. It was an old junk heap. When I got it, it was an old junk heap. When I sold it, it finally burned up. It caught fire. We were coming down the road with a load of pulp. But this is the truck that Boomgarden and I worked with in 1943. And it's also on another picture here that just got him on. That would be picture number 154 is the picture, the other picture of the truck. And there you see is myself on the left, and then Dwayne. Dwayne was just, I'm not sure if he was even 17 yet at this time. And then Hildor. We'd been hauling logs. We hauled them crossways. Laws weren't so strict in those days. But anyway, Dwayne and I had a lot of good times together, and some bad ones. But he likewise stayed to be a friend till he died. Number 156 is Hildor and Millie Norquist. I don't know quite where this picture was taken, nor what their age, but they're kind of cute, aren't they? Number 157 is, there's a lot of Norquists on there. That's why I kept this picture and why I'm including it in there. On the left is Manny. Manny was, I think Manny was younger than Charlie, but Manny was an awfully nice man. I liked him. Everybody I know liked Manny, and he come down and helped Hilda quite a bit after Charlie died. Pa Peterson told me how nice he was to work for, and that he got along great with the men. This was another one of Doran's attributes. He was a great supervisor. Men liked to work for him. He got a lot done. But next to Manny then is Louise. Now Louise, I am not sure, but Louise is much older than Hildor, and she had a miscarriage and died before I ever knew her. There's a big separation there. I'm not sure. It could be that Hilda had her before she was married to Charlie. I don't know. The next man continuing to the right, I don't know. The one behind there, I believe, is Arthur Hogberg, my uncle. And the short guy in front is Gottfried Norquist. He lived in Chicago, and he just came up briefly. And then it's Hilda Norquist, which was a great neighbor. And then Charlie. And Charlie with the dog between his legs is very typical of him. He was always doing something crazy like this. He was a lot of fun. Ma was to town with him one time, and Charlie got a little bit too much whiskey, and he backed off the edge of the dock and backed the Model T into the river there in Baudette. And then when they got home, they started home, why Charlie was driving, and he talked about going back, and Hilda slipped the billfold out of his pocket and gave it to Ma so he wouldn't have any money. But anyway, he was a big husky man, but he got heart trouble, and he died very young. I think probably not much after Grandpa did. But they were very close neighbors, and Vivian and I were just talking about how close neighbors things and how important neighbors were in those days. She mentioned that when they used to have ice cream at her place, that they would always enjoy it more if they invited Garfield and Laura Boquist over. And this was with us in Norquist. You went someplace and somebody would say, let's make ice cream, and that happened. It was very neighborly. Now I hope when I'm trying to put all of this stuff in one box, and in there I'm going to put in a couple of family histories and the accounts of the funerals and stuff of some of the family. I hope that whoever listens to this, whatever generation it is, that you would look on to some of the things that would let you know from what I've said in this and some of the things you read. And I'm also going to include in that box a little article I wrote about Pa Peterson, and it got into a kind of a senior citizens paper. And I've included one of them. So you can see the affection we had for neighbors, for family, and for teachers. It's a thing that it seems like it's disappearing from the world, and it saddens us all, Vivian and I particularly. So I hope that what I've been talking about here, that the tapes don't get ruined and things get so that somebody can make some use out of them.